Never, in all the years of ridiculous abuse of this organization, did I imagine that someone would have the audacity to throw away a military coffin. And not just any coffin, it was the ceremonial coffin of my grandfather, a decorated World War II veteran. The U.S. government sent it as a tribute to his service to his country, a tribute to a man who risked his life fighting for what he believed in, a piece of respect and honor. I had recently received the coffin, and, while we organized the official ceremony, it was temporarily stored in my garage, well protected, covered with an American flag folded with military precision. It was something sacred to my family, and then it was gone. I woke up early that morning and went to the garage. The space where the coffin was kept was empty. At first, I thought maybe someone in the family had moved it somewhere else, but as I asked everyone, despair began to grow in my chest. No one had touched it. The only logical conclusion was that someone had broken into my property and taken him. I tried to calm down, take a deep breath, and think rationally. Who could have done this? And then I looked across the street and saw the only person in this neighborhood who would have the nerve to commit such an atrocity. She was standing on the sidewalk, holding a cup of coffee, looking at the street with that superior look of someone who thinks she's the queen of the world. The woman from the HOA, the woman who had already tried to fine children for riding bicycles, who had a community garden removed because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing, who once threatened to evict a neighbor for leaving an American flag hanging from his balcony. The same woman who spent years making my life hell with ridiculous regulations and pointless complaints. If anyone had done it, it was her. I hurried across the street, feeling my blood boil with every step. I didn't want to create an unnecessary row, but I needed answers. As soon as I got close, she looked at me with a smug little smile, that smile of someone who thinks they have absolute power over everything. "Good morning," she said, tilting her head with false innocence. "You look worried." I kept myself from responding with a swear word. "Did you take what was in my garage?" I asked, trying to remain calm. She rolled her eyes as if the question was absurd. "Oh, you mean that horrible old box?" she said, with the greatest impudence in the world. "Yes, I had it removed. It looked like garbage." The world stopped. The air became heavy. My mind needed a few seconds to process what she had just said. She had thrown away my grandfather's coffin, the coffin of a war veteran. I felt my face heat up with anger. I've never wanted to shout at someone as much as I did at that moment. "You did what?" She let out an exaggerated sigh, as if bored with my indignation. "My God, there's no need for all this drama. The HOA has very clear rules about objects left out in the open. It was ugly. It looked abandoned. So I took the liberty of taking care of it for you." "Take care of it?" My voice came out lower than I expected, because I was holding back the urge to completely lose control. "You threw away a military tribute, a government ceremonial coffin." She blinked a few times, as if the realization hadn't sunk in yet. And then she unleashed the most absurd sentence of all. "I don't know why you're so angry. It was just an old box." It was at that moment that anyone with the slightest bit of common sense would realize they had made a mistake. But this woman? She still thought she was right. And it was exactly at that moment that fate decided it was time for her to learn a lesson. Because, while I was still trying to process her level of stupidity, the first black SUV came around the corner. Then another. Then another. The Pentagon was coming. The black SUVs pulled up in front of my house, and the whole neighborhood fell silent. The neighbors, who until then had been busy with their routines, now watched the scene as if it were a live-action movie. Mr. Jenkins's dog, who barked at anything, became quiet. The letter carrier, who always rushed past, stopped in the middle of the street to see what was happening. The doors of the vehicles opened at the same time, and men in black suits descended with a level of seriousness that would make anyone swallow. The leader of the group, a tall man with gray hair and a stony gaze, stopped on the sidewalk and looked around. He didn't need to say anything. His authority was visible. And that's when I realized The Pentagon wasn't kidding. The woman from the HOA hadn't realized it yet. She was still standing there holding her coffee cup, with that arrogant smile that made me want to laugh. "What the hell is that?" she muttered, frowning. "Oh dear, that's reality knocking on your door." The man in the black suit looked at me and nodded firmly. "Are you responsible for the complaint?" I nodded, crossing my arms. "Confirmed," I replied. "The ceremonial coffin of my grandfather, a war veteran, was removed from my property without permission. By the HOA, the tension in the air increased instantly. The officer blinked once, slowly, before turning his head to face the woman who, until then, had thought she ran the neighborhood. She finally began to feel the weight of the situation. "HOA?" the agent repeated, with a calm that sent shivers down my spine. "So, you mean you're behind the disappearance of a military artifact?" Her face paled. "Ah, well, that's an exaggeration," she started to say, forcing a nervous laugh. "It wasn't a military artifact. It was just an ugly box that was in front of his house. The HOA rules are very clear about the appearance of the neighborhood." The agent stood completely still. The tension was so strong that you could feel the heavy air around him. "An ugly box?" he repeated. The woman took a step back, as if finally beginning to realize that she had said the worst possible thing. I didn't know it was important," she tried to make amends. "I thought it was garbage." I closed my eyes for a second. My God, this woman really couldn't stop digging her own hole. The agent took a deep breath through his nose and looked at one of the other men on the team. "Locate the coffin," he ordered. "Now." One of the agents took the radio from his belt and started talking rapidly to someone on the other end of the line. "Confirmed. We need a trace on the waste removal from this area. Object: military ceremonial coffin. Official government identification." Karen's eyes widened. "Trace?" she asked, sounding offended. "But why? If it's already been collected, then it's probably already been disposed of. We can just forget about it and move on." Ah, that was the worst thing she could have said. The agent took a step towards her, and I swear I felt the whole neighborhood hold its breath. "The Pentagon doesn't forget, ma'am." It was at that moment that Karen realized she was completely screwed. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The neighbors were enjoying the show. Mrs. Jenkins, who had already been fined for the colorful flowers in her garden, muttered to someone next door, "This is better than the soap opera." And then the officer's radio beeped. "We have a location," said a voice on the other end. "He was taken to a disposal center a few kilometers from here, but he hasn't been processed yet." Relief hit me in the chest. The coffin could still be recovered, but for Karen, the terror had only just begun. The agent turned to me and nodded. "We'll recover the item immediately. And you," he looked directly at Karen, "need to come with us to explain yourself." The woman blinked, looking completely lost. "What? But why?" The agent raised an eyebrow. "Because you interfered with the fate of a military artifact in an illegal way. That could be considered misappropriation of government property." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked around for some support, some help, but what she found were neighbors holding back their laughter, watching the queen of the HOA finally being put in her place. And then despair took over. "But I didn't do anything wrong." The agent wasn't shaken. "Ma'am, refusing to cooperate could make this much worse for you. I've never seen someone lose color so quickly." The agents began to move, getting into their SUVs to start the search for the coffin. Meanwhile, one of the men in a suit stood next to Karen, clearly making sure she didn't run away. I leaned against the gate of my house, crossing my arms and enjoying every second of the spectacle. This woman had spent years fining her neighbors for garbage that didn't exist, handing out arbitrary punishments, and thinking she owned the neighborhood. And now she was about to discover that certain rules are much bigger than those of the HOA, and that the Pentagon doesn't forgive idiots. Karen was standing there, surrounded by government agents, her face whiter than paper. For the first time in her life, she realized that her ridiculous HOA rules meant nothing in the face of the weight of real authority. The neighborhood was watching everything as if it were the event of the year. Some were already filming discreetly. Others were simply enjoying the moment, savoring the end of the empire of the woman who made everyone hell. But Karen, even cornered, wasn't ready to accept defeat. That's ridiculous, she said, trying to keep her composure. I'm a respectable citizen. I have rights. The officer in the dark suit didn't even blink. And your right to remain silent is about to come in very handy. If there was one thing Karen didn't know how to do, it was keep quiet. She opened her mouth to retort, but before she could say another piece of nonsense that would make her situation worse, one of the government SUVs received a new transmission. The coffin has been located, intact. It hasn't been processed yet. I felt a weight come off my chest. My grandfather would not have his tribute destroyed by this woman. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she was about to faint. See, she tried to argue, the coffin is still there. There's no need for all this fuss. The officer turned his head slowly and looked at her as if she were a particularly annoying piece of garbage on the sidewalk. Ma'am, the fact that it hasn't been destroyed yet doesn't change the crime you committed. Karen gasped, as if someone had slapped her in the face. She turned to her neighbors, hoping for support, but everyone was reveling in her fall. Mr. Jenkins, who had already been fined because his garbage can had been left out on the sidewalk for 2 minutes, took a sip of his beer and smiled. Mrs. Smith, who had received a warning because her bushes were asymmetrical, crossed her arms and shook her head, satisfied. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was on Karen's side. And then came the final blow. The chief agent picked up the radio and said just 4 words, "Bring in the coffin now." Less than 15 minutes later, a military vehicle pulled into the street, carrying the coffin back. And man, what a scene! The vehicle stopped in front of my house, and 2 soldiers got out and lifted the coffin as if they were carrying a sacred artifact. And that was it. They knew the value of it. "Object safely recovered," said one of the soldiers. "We await instructions for its official relocation." The government agent nodded. Then he turned to Karen. "Now, let's talk about responsibility for this mess." Karen almost stumbled backwards. But I didn't know," she stammered. "If I'd known it was a real coffin, I never would have." "If you'd bothered to ask the owner of the house, you'd have avoided all this," the agent replied, with no patience for her theatrics. I stood there with my arms crossed, savoring every second. Karen tried one more card. "I can fix this," she pleaded. "There's no need to involve the courts." The agent let out a deep sigh. "The Pentagon is already involved, ma'am. The question now is simple. Are we going to solve this here, or do you want military lawyers involved?" She swallowed. This was the first time I had seen Karen truly at a loss. There were no more HOA regulations that could save her. She looked around, desperate, but the neighbors weren't going to help her. She looked at me, as if hoping for some mercy. But after years of abuse of power, absurd fines, and authoritarian control, all I did was smile slightly and enjoy the moment. Because, finally, Karen's dictatorship was falling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Karen was pale, her eyes wide, her breath short. She finally realized that she wasn't dealing with just any neighbor with whom she could pretend to be superior and make up idiotic HOA rules. She had messed with the Pentagon. The federal agents were there, looking at her like she was an inconvenient insect that needed to be squashed. The neighbors, who had spent years being fined, warned, and humiliated by this woman, were now all watching her destruction with an almost vengeful pleasure. I was having more fun than at any other time in my life. The older agent, the one who was clearly in charge of the operation, continued to show no emotion. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cold as ice, "the fact that the coffin was recovered does not negate the crime of improper interference with a federally owned item. The Pentagon does not take these situations lightly." The woman almost collapsed. I can fix this," she tried to insist. "I can pay for any damage." The officer blinked, not even bothering to respond to this imbecility. "We're taking this case for legal evaluation," he said. "Sir," now speaking to me, "can you file a formal complaint against the HOA And the person responsible for the unauthorized removal? I smiled. The moment I'd been waiting for. Absolutely, Karen choked. No, that's not necessary. We can settle this between us, like civilized neighbors. Mr. Jenkins from across the street laughed out loud. Oh, now you want to be civilized neighbors? The collective laughter of the neighborhood was the last shovel of dirt in Karen's social grave. She knew there was no way out of it. Then the best scene of all happened. 2 federal agents stepped forward, opening handcuffs. Ma'am, we need you to come with us. Karen took a step back. What? You can't arrest me. The officer didn't even blink. You are being detained to clarify the case. You are not formally under arrest, but your cooperation is mandatory. She started to struggle. This is an injustice. I'm from the HOA. I have rights. Ah, that desperate cry of, I am from the HOA, was music to my ears. And then the officers took her away. There, in front of everyone, she was removed as president of the HOA. The final blow. The end of her era. After the meeting, Karen rushed home. And then, the next day, a house for sale sign appeared in front of her house. The woman couldn't cope with the humiliation. With no power, no respect, no one to flatter her, there was nothing left to hold her back. The neighborhood, on the other hand, was overjoyed. A week later, a moving truck showed up. Karen was carrying boxes with a blank expression, as if she were in shock. She got into the car, didn't look at anyone, and drove off. No goodbyes, no tributes, no importance. She had spent years trying to boss everyone around, and now no one cared where she was going. The neighborhood was finally free. Children could play without fear of fines. Neighbors could decorate their houses however they wanted. But what about me? I sat on my balcony, sipping my coffee, and just watched the scene, savoring my victory. Karen tried to use her power against the wrong person and lost everything in the process. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.